He says, you want to love God? Look at the world you live in. Look at nature. Look at the human body. There's so much genius, so much beauty, so much uniqueness in every aspect of every molecule of creation. The continuation of the Parashat speaks primarily about the three main holidays of our Torah, as well as the subsequent ones. Speaks about primarily Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, and it goes through the detail. If anyone pays attention, on Pesach and on Sukkot, we actually read from the beginning of this parasha, Shor or Kesav Oez, and then we go almost to the end of the parasha. Because it speaks about Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. So very good, we read it on Pesach and Sukkot. So the Zera Shimshon in this week delves into the Arbat Haminim, although we're 6 months too late, or you want to call it 6 months too early, but it's never the wrong time to learn a new novelty on something which we might have always taken for granted. We all know the main midrashim on the 4 species that we hold during Sukkot: the etrog, the lulav, hadas, and aravot. We all know the main midrashim, we all know what they resemble and why, but the Zera Shimshon, in my opinion, takes a new twist on things, which is his own interesting and novel way, which to many of us maybe have never even heard it. So listen to what he does. He says, obviously the 4 species are commanded by God to be picked up, danced around with, if you want to call it that way, very, very soon after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, after we were forgiven, a brand new slate, new year, new page. Very good. So he starts off with the etrog. He says the etrog is something which we know the Midrash always tells us that it resembles tzaddikim. He doesn't get into all of the details, but he says it resembles tzaddikim. One who would be completely righteous is resembled to an etrog. Listen to a new twist, he says. He says, what are the laws which qualify or disqualify an etrog from being used on Sukkot? If an etrog has a hole or missing anything, that completely disqualifies it from being used. However, if there's a growth, it doesn't disqualify it. If it's not 100% straight, it's still allowed to be done. You're still allowed to take it and make a bracha on it, no problem. Only tzaddikim gemurim have in a physical way, a perfect etrog, but in a spiritual way, they're complete. There's no holes, there's no growths, it's straight, it's perfectly symmetrical. But let's see now what disqualifies one from being righteous or not. There are certain avirot which are considered to be much more stringent than others. For example, the 3 cardinal sins: murder, adultery, idolatry. They're very, very severe sins. Those type of sins in that category are type of sins which make a hole in a person's neshama. They take the person's they take the person's soul and make a hole in it. And it unfortunately disqualifies an individual until they really put much, much effort into the teshuvah for those 3 cardinal sins with which a person is supposed to give up their life for before committing. And other sins that are not as severe, they're still severe, but they're not as severe. They are, as the Zera Shimshon says, likened to an extra growth on the etrog. It doesn't necessarily disqualify one from being a righteous individual because they slipped or they made a mistake. That's fine. If it's one of the 3 cardinal sins, it's very severe. You've got to take the teshuvah process much more seriously than not. But if it's another type of sin, especially if it has to do with yetzer hara or laziness or any of the sort, all the other types of sins, it's a growth, it's an imperfection, yet it never disqualifies. This is how he takes the twist on the etrog. He moves on to the lulav. He He says, as the Midrash says, lulav is likened to the spine. So what's so special about a spine? He says as follows. If you look at an individual, the older they get, the more hunched over their back gets. Today, this morning, I had the privilege of meeting two Holocaust survivors, husband and wife. One of them was 91, one of them was 92 and a half. And I was speaking to them for a moment, and the Holocaust survivors are, in my opinion, the most special individuals which are walking the face of this earth. The courage they had to hold on to their lives and to go through what they went through, and coming out and deciding to rebuild a family, rebuild the Jewish people. There's no words to express how special that is. And if you've noticed, if anyone's ever spoken to Holocaust survivors, there's two types. There's the type which is stone and very, very closed about what happened and doesn't really want to talk about it. But then there's the other type which is very open about it and talks, and as soon as you start talking to them, their eyes start tearing up. I mean, they've been telling this story over for 90 years, 80 years. And every single time, that type, it's not everyone, but that type of Holocaust survivor tears up and gets emotional to show how hard it really, really was. And why am I bringing this up? Because it's a great merit to meet someone who's 80, 90 and up. A person's back and spine starts hunching over when we get older. It's a fact of life. We cannot beat the old age. The old age is running after us, and it will catch up with us, and eventually 120 or before, and we're in the next world. The Zera Shimshon says, a spine is what we say the body part that resembles the lulav. If you look at a lulav, it has to be straight. If it's bent over already, the laws are very, very intricate to say, is it still a kosher lulav or not? Alluding to the opportune and prime time for an individual to do teshuvah is in their youth. Talmud says, you cannot compare the teshuvah of an individual who is young to an individual who is older. The younger the individual, the greater the desire and the lust. The younger the individual, the easier it is to break out of the habit, and the more noble it is. This is one thing he says about the spine and the lulav having a correspondence, young age. The second is a lulav is very tall, so is a spine. It's actually the longest or tallest single bone, even though there's many different parts to it. But if we call different bones, even though legs are very long, the separation is quite apparent between the two. The spine is, even though it's many different little parts, but it's one long, and it's the longest bone of a person's body. So is the lulav out of all the other species. Alluding to when a Baal Teshuvah does Teshuvah, an individual comes closer and reconnects to God, they are raised so high and close to God, higher than a person who was born into the religion and grew up with the religion their whole life. Talmud says, Makom she ba'ale teshuvah omdim, tzadikim gemurin enam omdim sham. That a Baal Teshuvah, they were here, they were in the impurity, they were in the filth, it's fine. But they came and they reconnected to God, they're able to zoom up to heights higher than even where the tzaddik who was born from day one is. Alluding to the height of the lulav and the height of the spine. He says something else very interesting. If you look at a lulav, it is actually perfectly symmetrical in the way that the leaves are. You have exactly half of the leaf or half of the leaves on one side and on the other side. Yet at the bottom, it all comes down to one source and one stem. Alluding to, on one side, a person has merits and mitzvot. And on the other side, a person has dismerits and avirot. But at the end of the day, they all come. So the Zera Shimshon says, I couldn't invent this even if I wanted to. At the end of the day, it all comes down to that main stem. It's all an offshoot from there, telling us that if a person does teshuvah, proper teshuvah, as we learned last week, teshuvah me'ahava, teshuvah from love, you're able to take, just as one side is mitzvot, the other side, which is avirot, you're able to change them into merits, into mitzvot, through real teshuvah. Real teshuvah starts with yirah, but then it upgrades to the higher level of ahava, of teshuvah from love. He says one more interesting thing about the lulav. He says, we gather all 4 of these species and we make one beracha on them. The beracha of al netilat lulav. Why the lulav? The Talmud, the Midrash, everyone says the etrog is the most beautiful and the most special, and it's the tzaddik, and it has Torah, and it has mitzvot, and so let's say al netilat etrog. Why the lulav? It's a famous question. The Zera Shimshon's answer I've never heard. And he says, because a Baal Teshuvah, and this spine alludes to the whole concept of Teshuvah, stands higher than other Yehudim, he's worthy of being mentioned that the bracha will be called on him. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. You're talking huge tzaddikim, Gdolei Hador. They grew up in the yeshiva. They were born in the yeshiva. Lo alenu, they died in the yeshiva. They're still not as great as the Baal Teshuvah. The Zera Shimshon is teaching us an important message. Never give up on your teshuvah or on anyone else's for that matter. You see a person who, lo alenu, everyone's given up on, there's no such thing as given up. If God hasn't given up on that person, we cannot give up on that person. If God hasn't given up on us, we can't give up on ourselves. It's never too late to do teshuvah. Yes, do it when your back is strong and tall, when you're young, and do it in the best way possible. But it's still never too late. Al netilat lulav, he says. He moves on to the hadassim, the third of the species. He says that the halacha which allows or which qualifies or disqualifies the hadassim is the majority or the abundance of its leaves. The hadassim, we grab 3 of them, and the most highest level of the hadas is when you have literally like rings of hadassim, of the leaves, each on its own. It's called mishulash. That 3 leaves are coming from the same place on the branch. And then above that again, and again, and again. Opposed to it being random, the leaves of the hadassim, to having 3 coming from this point, 3 coming from this point, 3 coming from this point, and 3, and 3, and 3. So then Shimshon says, and he says something very interesting. He goes, the leaves are corresponding good deeds, and the stem corresponds wisdom. If I have 3 leaves together, and they are literally covering the majority, if not all, of the spine of this hadas bush or this plant, what happens is that the leaves are overcoming it and taking over and covering it, and which means the deeds of a person should be more than the wisdom that they know. And he says this is exactly what we read this past week in Pirkei Avot. If you open up to chapter 3 in Pirkei Avot, Mishnah 12, it says, Hu haya omer, kol shema'asav merubim chochmato, chochmato mitkayemet. If a person's deeds are more than they know, their wisdom will continue. But opposite, if a person's wisdom is more than what he does, and chochmato mitkayemet, their chochmah will not be everlasting. Means as follows: if you know this amount of what you're supposed to do, act as a person, act as a Jew, but you only do this, so what's it worth? But opposite, if you know this amount and you're doing this amount of good deeds, It means you're doing above and beyond of what you know, and it's obviously in good faith, and you're trying, and you're doing, and you're doing, and you're doing. That's what God wants. So the Zera Shimshon says, look at this hadas. Look at this very interesting branch. The branch is almost completely covered by its leaves, alluding to having more good deeds than wisdom that a person knows. He says it specifically to be 3 each, because when a person learns Torah, Talmud says you're supposed to divide your time of learning Torah into 3 different categories. Chumash, Mishnah, and Gemara. Chumash meaning the written Torah. The Mishnah meaning the basic oral Torah. And the Gemara meaning making it very practical. Gemara back then is like saying halakha nowadays, so you should know. But that's what it means. It means to be well-rounded in your learning, all 3. He says one more. He says a person who learns Torah has an obligation to pray that not only his Torah continues, and he continues learning, but his children, the 2nd generation, and the 3rd generation, his grandchildren, all follow the derech, the path of Torah and mitzvot. As parents and grandparents, we have that obligation to at least that immediate 3 generations, yourself and the following 2, to pray for them and to teach them and to be involved in their very lives. The last one he mentions is the aravot, and aravot is a very quick one. Aravot, the Midrash says, resembles the lips. If we look at what disqualifies aravot, it's them being wilted and dried out. Now look at what he says. He says now an opposite chidush. He says, a person who wants to connect themselves to God and connect themselves to Torah, they have to learn Torah so hard and literally kill themselves to learn. Not literally kill, but kill themselves to learn. So much that they even lose their voice over it. That their lips get dried up over it because they're talking about it nonstop because they love it so much. Wilting one's lips, even though it disqualifies the aravot, is something which gives a tremendous amount of blessing to an individual who commits themselves to learning Torah. A person should never be shy to learn Torah, shy to speak of Torah. You might find yourself amongst family or friends, and they're talking about something and you feel out of place to say, let's change the discussion. We know how important it is on the Shabbat table to only speak divrei Torah, only speak things of Shabbat. And this one's bringing politics, and this one's bringing sports, and this one's bringing fashion, and this one's bringing business. And it is all the Yetziraras all coming to the table at the same time. Zera Shimshon says, wilt your lips. Dry out your lips because you'll try in every way possible. Prepare from before. Speak non-stop about Torah. Try to maintain the conversation to where it's supposed to be. This is specifically by Shabbat and Yom Tov, but even in other conversations, you find yourself with family, you find yourself at a simcha, at an occasion, in a smart way. It takes time, especially when you want to engage your spouse, or your children, or your grandchildren, or your guests who might not be so interested. Try in every which way to dry out your mouth, to wilt your lips. Look at that. It's a blessing to wilt your lips in order to speak divrei Torah. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu bless us. In the merit of the Zera Shimshon, in the merit of these 4 species, in the merit of the teshuvah that he speaks about, and the connection to the previous generations, the future generations, all through our holy Torah. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.